I think the content is always there. You just have to make sure you can lead the kids to the content. Because a lot of times when they're thinking on their own, they're doing lab reports, they're coming up with ideas, a lot of times you just have to make sure you are constantly being the facilitator and questioning them to lead them back to the main content that you want them to know. So I think the important piece of that is that you as the teacher have to know what that content is you want them to get at the end of the lesson.
Using inquiry to teach content is one of the best ways to get the kids to really take ownership of the content. It's just kind of a different way of teaching them a specific content instead of giving them all of the information and saying, remember this, giving them an ownership in it and saying, figure this out a little bit, figure this out for yourself. And that tends to, in my experience, cement those ideas, those content ideas, much better in their mind than just the traditional memorize this and tell me back on a test.
I can see where you could try to focus on one or the other, but in reality, you're going to pull both. You're going to use both process and content into a lesson, whether you're trying to or not, in order to explain something that maybe happens during the experiment itself, and you're discussing it with your kids after, during the conclusion and result phase. You know, that group learning, that coming back together and sharing your ideas, you're going to go through all of that information.
Okay, I had to do 3 inquiries. The first one was a structured inquiry, which required basically myself giving the kids everything they needed to do the experiments. The question, the procedure, the data tables, just the cookbook thing. And I had them progress from that to the guided inquiry, where I still gave them a question and I gave them materials, but they had to come up with the procedure and they had to complete everything else. And then we went to the open, so it was really a stair-stepping, where we went to the open inquiry and they received, by that time, just the idea that we were working on, and they had to come up with everything. And by the time we got there, they were really ready for it, and they bloomed with it.
For me, this project was about rethinking the way that I teach science, rethinking a lot of the lessons that I used in science and the activities, and giving up control of lessons to the students and allowing them to explore, allowing them to formulate questions and explore and collect data and present their findings. I guess in a nutshell for me, it was about giving up some control that I fought to try to hang on to for a long time. So that's really what it did for me. It opened that door to allowing students to have control of their learning from the aspect of developing their own questions.
I wanted to find different ways of reaching my students. So I never know what type of classroom I'm going to be in. I wanted to be able to adapt a certain type of lesson, where it could be more hands-on and where the students are actually almost teaching themselves than just sitting there and listening to a lecture or, like I said, a PowerPoint where they kind of zone out. So it keeps them more, it makes them participate and keeps them more interested.
Today, Jimmy and I are going to talk about how to choose a level of inquiry. My name is Drew Rutledge. I teach at William Campbell Middle School, and I teach now 6th grade life science.
And my name is Jimmy Kirschberger. I teach 8th grade earth science right up the road here at Amherst Middle School. And we're going to play off a little bit of what Wanda and Jesse said about choosing a question and a little bit about what Jill said about the levels of inquiry, and kind of share with you a little bit about our process of how we chose which level of inquiry to do. And the good news is you can't really be wrong. You can use any of the levels. It just might look a little bit different, and you'll see kind of as we get into it, it's really based on what you're comfortable with, based on a few factors that we'll show you. But it all starts with the question. And similar to the format that Wanda and Jesse showed you, I like to use the same format that they use. How does blank affect blank? But then another format I like to emphasize is the word relationship. What's the relationship between blank and blank? So choosing your level of inquiry in any sort of inquiry always starts with a question. And I found if you use kind of a consistent format, that it helps the kids kind of get into a rhythm. And the way that I would start often is I would start by giving the kids some sort of scenario that's going to lead them to a question, whether it's giving them a bunch of materials that they don't really know what they're for and having them just experiment, as Wanda and Jesse gave you the little cubes. Or if it's just a picture, something like this, which this will be kind of the example that we're going to use today since we don't really have time to go through an entire inquiry lesson. But this is a picture I used in my class to inspire some questions. And so they just look at the picture. And what types of questions, and I try to encourage them to stick with this format of the question. So what types of questions might you have if you look at a picture like this? How do you get on it? That's an excellent question, yeah. I've always wondered about that with the old-timey big wheel bicycles, but...
Why is the gear attached to the back wheel?
Okay, why is the gear attached to the back wheel instead of the front wheel?
What would happen if you added another gear?
Okay, the number of gears. So these are all things to inspire, and I wrote down a few questions that people have had, that some of my students have had in the past. And these are kind of some of the questions that they've come up with. How does the size of the wheel affect the speed of the bike? How big does the man's mustache need to be to ride the bike? How does the number of gears affect the speed of the bike? And how does the bike affect the speed? So you can have them ask all kinds of questions. Doesn't mean that you're going to do an experiment on all of these. Obviously, the second one we're not going to do an experiment on. So with an open inquiry, they're coming up with their own questions. But what you can do is you can weed out some of those questions. So what I would do, I kind of weed out that first one. The person who came up with that question was clearly searching for attention. But the other ones, they'll come up with questions that always need a little bit of tweaking. It's an art form to coming up with these testable questions. For example, this last one, how does the bike affect the speed? This is kind of a classic example of what you're going to get. They're going to fill in those blanks with things that can't really be measured. So you have to tweak that a little bit and say, okay, be more specific. What about the bike? What can you measure about the bike? Is it the number of gears on the bike, the size of the wheel? Okay, so there's all these questions that you can come up with, and just because it's an open inquiry doesn't mean you have to just roll with whatever question they come up with.
All right, and as Jill said earlier, there are 3 different levels to inquiry. And we're going to just briefly touch on this again. And you'll see this in a structure. As the teacher, you are going to be providing to your students the question and the method. And this is when you want them to come up with a solution. For the guided, you're going to be giving them the question. They need to come up with the method. How are they going to answer this question that you give them? And then for the open, this is where your student is going to be formulating the question, formulating the method, and formulating the solution. A lot of the times you'll see the stair-step method, but Jimmy and I always like to look at it in a different way.
We wanted to kind of address some of the misconceptions here. A lot of times we like to think of it as a spectrum, more of instead of a stair step. Because that kind of gives the impression a lot of people have that structured is down here. If you're doing structured, you're barely doing inquiry. If you're doing open, you're there at the top of the step and you've reached, but that's not really what it is. All right? There are perfect times to use structured, open, and guided, and we like to think of it more as a spectrum, where the teacher control versus student control is on this spectrum here. And there are times where you want to pick one versus the other. It doesn't necessarily mean that open is always the best or structured is always the best.
All right, so now to the meat of our presentation. So how are you going to choose which level you're going to use? We think there are 4 important reasons to choose a level, and those are experience with inquiry, what your lesson objectives and goals are, your resources and your time, and what content you are trying to reach. All right, so when talking about experience with inquiry, you need to look at student experience and you need to look at teacher experience. And I talk about student readiness first, okay? So students are a lot more ready to do this than you think. A lot of teachers, we're control freaks. I know I am, okay? You got to give away that control. And they're a lot more ready to do this than you think they are. We think it's a good idea to use structured first, because this kind of models what you expect them to do throughout the other levels. You are giving them the question, you are giving them the method, and then they have to do the data analysis. Look at what the data that they have and come up with a solution. This kind of models what they need to do with the guided and with the open. And they will surprise you of how fast they pick this up. We've been doing this throughout the year, and I tell you, they truly enjoy it, and they'll pick it up and they want to do it, and they want to actually make graphs, so that just really surprises me. So then teacher readiness, okay? If you know the content, you can teach with inquiry, and you can reach multiple content levels. The more experienced you become, the easier all levels become. And going with that, growth over time. We all grow over time. We get better at what we're doing the more we do it. And I think that has a big to do with experience. And then how comfortable you feel doing the levels of inquiry and how comfortable the students feel. Obviously, a student is probably not going to be comfortable writing a procedure, looking at data if they've never done that before. So that's why we think it's a good idea to start with structure. But as you go through over time, each level is going to become easier. And each level is going to become easier for the student, and it's going to become easier for you.
When we first started sitting down thinking about this, this is the first thing that we thought and we felt was probably one of the biggest determiners of which level you want to choose is your goals, your unit goals and your unit objectives. You have to have very clear goals and objectives of what you want the kids to do, what you want the kids to learn, and how specific they are can be a good guiding tool for which level of inquiry you want to do. For example, I put a couple pictures here to kind of remind me. Earlier in the year, I had a goal where I really wanted the students to understand the relationship between the temperature of the air and the relative humidity. So with a goal that specific, I leaned toward a structured inquiry, where I actually gave them, I actually took it even super structured, where I gave them the data, and I really wanted them to focus on analyzing the data. Because that was my very specific, my main goal was for them to be able to look at that data, plot it on a graph, and make a conclusion from that. So when you've got very specific goals, structure tends to work better. Now, none of these things that we're giving you are hard and fast rules. They're all kind of little tools, little things for you to look at to kind of help guide your decision making. And then later in the year, I started a unit on soil where my goals weren't as specific as far as the content that I wanted them to learn and what I wanted them to know. So I gave them several different types of soil and let them come up with their own question. And the questions that they came up with covered all kinds of things that we were getting ready to do in a unit on soil and erosion. So any of their experiments they came up with, some of them focused on the permeability of soil, some of them focused on the absorption of heat of different kinds of soil, some of them focused on erosion of different types of soil. So we were able to cover a very, very wide range of content by looking at everybody's different project that they did and then sharing that with the class. So the specificity is one of the biggest guiding factors. How specific are your goals? So you really need to, when you want to do an inquiry lesson, you really need to sit down first and focus on what are your goals. Not just, hey, I want to do an inquiry lesson, let's just pick something. So really sit down and figure out what exactly you want them to know first. That'll help guide you.
All right, and resources and time. For resources, the more resources you have, the more flexible you are going to be for which level you want to do. A lot of inquiries are done by just putting out materials and letting your students come up with their question, come up with their procedure. And then we think time. Time is a big determiner on inquiry. So depending on experience of students, open inquiry can take longer than other levels of inquiry. We say this because it takes students time to think. And it's really hard to plan for it. Your students may be coming up with a question for a class period. They may come up and take 2 class periods to come up with a procedure. Open inquiry seems to take more time. I know a lot of times I feel like I'm pushing my kids along. I'm like, we need to get through this. But they do need time to think, and you need to give them this time. And then data analysis seems to take the most time for structured inquiry. And this is what I like to focus on, and I know Jimmy likes to focus on when we do structured inquiries, is for them to look at that data they're getting and be able to analyze it.
And then content, the specific, this kind of goes along with the previous slide that I talked about, but I don't want to talk necessarily now about the goals, but more the specific type of content. Any content can really lend itself to inquiry, no matter what content you're doing. But I wanted to speak a little bit about an experience I had with using modeling as kind of my tool for inquiry. It was a little bit different than what your traditional inquiry would look like. You have an independent variable that you manipulate, and then you have your dependent variable that you measure, and then you put it on a graph and you answer a question. But I did a couple of modeling type of inquiries this year where the students, in one of them, they actually physically made a model to demonstrate the phases of the moon. So they had to have the sun, the earth, and the moon, and move them around until they could see the different phases. And in other times, I had where they used computer simulation models. And in those cases, especially with earth science, you need to do a lot of modeling. There's all kinds of content with earth science that uses modeling, and modeling can be a great tool. But to use modeling as inquiry, I found works really well. That every time they adjust their model, they're really manipulating their variables. Every little time they moved the earth in their model, they were changing a variable. They were changing the relative positions of each. But content is something that really any content can't be taught using inquiry, but there are certain contexts where you can use some unique approaches like modeling. So in summary, these are, when we sat down to try to think of what informed our decisions when deciding what levels of inquiry to use, these were the 4 major things. But we really wanted to emphasize that none of them are hard and fast rules, like I said before, and it's really about what are you comfortable with. Based on your goals and your objectives, what level are you comfortable with? Based on the amount of time and resources that you have, what are you comfortable with? Based on how ready you think you are, or you think the kids are, to come up with their own questions, to come up with their own procedures, which level are you more comfortable with? And like Drew said, the kids will surprise you. The kids know how to do inquiry. I always tell them, you know exactly how to conduct a good controlled experiment. If I say, Jeff, Carlos can throw the ball farther than you, I guarantee you they're going to control every single variable. They're going to go up to the football field and they're going to make sure that their foot is on the same line and the wind is blowing the same direction because they don't want anybody to get an advantage. So deep down, kids have inquiring minds and they know how to do an inquiry procedure. You just got to kind of pull that out of them. So they can do it, you can do it. It's not a stair step where structured is the worst, open is the best, and you want to work up to that. You can start with an open inquiry and work your way back down. There really is no hard and fast rules. So, thanks.
Thank you.